She was at the coding thing. She knows my body. Exactly. Coming. I forget everything. I know, right? Yes, exactly. Is she married now? Because I know she's engaged. Is she married now or no?
There's so many, like, we don't do secret series accounting. We don't really do a lot of the pre-calc topics, you know, because we have done a lot. I had an interview.
So why don't we get started? Good afternoon.
And 1 point in the middle.
I'm going to suggest that we do your name and where you are. 5-second interview. 5-second introductions. I don't want to take more than 1 minute and 20 seconds on this, but I want Beth to know who's in the room. So we'll start here.
My name is Andre Matherin, and I teach at the Northwest School in Seattle, Washington.
And he came down to join the meeting.
I am Trang Vu from La Jolla High School, and I work with Ovi on project.
Obi Soto, I'm here in Grade.
Raymond LaRochelle, MSED.
Megan Dorico, postdoc here.
I'm Cheryl Lynch. I'm a teacher for the juvenile court and community schools through the county.
I'm Karen, I'm a PhD student at Crimson here.
I'm Leslie Diedeker, and I'm a researcher at Boston University.
Donna Ross, I'm a science educator in the School of Teacher Ed.
Lisa Lamb, math educator, teacher ed. Jen Lineback, Point Loma Nazarene in the biology department and School of Ed.
Chrissy, I'll put it back to you.
Oh, Chrissy Ada, Sweetwater Union High School District.
Dana Trick, Sweetwater.
Esmeralda Orozco, Sweetwater High School.
I'm
Linda Wynn, MSED student.
And videographer today. Thank you.
I'm Lauren Stewart. I'm one of the MSED doc students here.
Claire Mateo, master's student and teaching assistant at San Diego State.
C. David Walters, I'm a doc student here in the MSED program.
In the middle of interviewing for jobs.
Yeah.
I'm Fred Goldberg, Department of Physics, here.
Beth Stein from UC San Diego in education studies.
So this is an unusually geographically diverse group in the audience, and we're delighted to have you. I'm Randy Phillip. I'm here at San Diego State, and I'm the director of the Center for Research in Math and Science Education. And I have the pleasure of briefly introducing Beth. Pleasure because she's a special person. She's the associate professor in the College of Education at the University of California, Irvine. Her research interests in general include teacher thinking and learning, the design of pre-service teacher education and professional development, and in particular, she thinks a lot about how you support teachers developing their noticing practices for ambitious instruction. She's an expert on thinking about video and uses of video for professional development purposes. She's currently directing the teacher ed program at the University of California, Irvine. And she's also an expert in noticing and a great colleague. I had the pleasure of working with her very closely on a project, and her chapter was one of the best in the book that we had. So.
Because of Randy.
So,
Randy challenged me to cut, I had to cut how many words? It was something like, this is a problem I have when I write. I had to cut something like 3,000 words. You know, it was just like basically pull out chunks, like figure out the chunk that doesn't belong in the paper. And then he said, what was it, for every 100 words, it was something like he challenged me, for every 100 words, I'd get glasses of wine or something. So a group of us went out for dinner at AMTE one year, and Randy treated everyone to wine because I had met my goal of getting rid of all those words. So,
I don't do it with graduate students.
Write a chapter for Randy sometime.
So it is a delight to be here today. Thank you for inviting me to come share my research. And I will just say Randy has just been the most fabulous mentor to me in my early careers as a researcher at UCI. And so those of you who are, and Lisa knows this as well, and he's just like the best colleague. So though he's not down the hallway, I always feel like if I need to call someone, Randy will always answer the phone, and it's really great. And he has really helped me think about my work and push my thinking on it. So I thought I could give a talk that I've given before But I decided not to do that. I'm going to give a talk that is a paper that's going to be coming out in Cognition and Instruction. It was like giving birth to a child, if any of you ever try to publish in that journal. It's probably a lot like Jeremy, is my guess. So I'm going to try to give you a sense of what that paper's about and take on some questions to talk about that. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about pre-service teachers noticing practices of ambitious instruction. And I emphasize practices because for a while people talked about teachers noticing, but we never kind of talked about like, what is that? And like when we talk about it as a practice, what does that mean for noticing to be a practice? So I've been thinking about that and I don't have it sorted out. I put it forth in this paper and I had some thoughts come to me as I was putting the talk together the last couple days. So I think we can engage around that conversation today. So I want to situate my talk in a broader line of inquiry that frames my work. Much of my work has been thinking about how to help teachers develop a professional vision of instruction. And in particular, we can think about that, a professional vision of ambitious mathematics instruction. And Chuck Goodwin defines professional vision as socially organized ways of seeing and understanding events, excuse me, that are answerable to the distinctive interests of a particular social group. So if we think about that for teaching, it raises a variety of questions, which is one is what do teachers attend to? I was actually just talking yesterday with a group. I had a physical therapist once and I said to her, it must pain you to walk in the world and watch people just walking around because you're noticing all this stuff that we are oblivious to, right? And she said, yes, sometimes I have to shut things out. I just can't look at it, right? And I used to blow off that comment. And now I'm starting to think about, well, that is something about noticing. The idea of like not paying attention, and we're going to talk about that, right? But what are people attending to? How do they understand what they see? So, you know, we take all these frameworks that we accumulate through our life and our participation in a variety of communities. How does that frame the way we make sense of what we're seeing? And then how are teachers socialized to see and understand teaching in particular ways? Now we all know the early work that tells us that through teachers' participation in elementary and middle school and high school that frames the way that they think about teaching. But I take more of a design perspective as a learning scientist. I try to think about how can we design learning environments and have conjectures about how we can socialize teachers into looking at teaching and learning in new ways. So what does it mean to develop a vision of ambitious instruction? The group in here, I don't need to sell you on this. A view of ambitious instruction is one that's a much more student-centered, responsive approach to teaching. I've been doing some work with Vicki Hand on thinking about noticing for equity. So we've been really thinking about not just attending to student thinking, but in addition to that, attending to issues of access, participation, and power, and how those two things are sort of going on at the same time, and a teacher has to attend to all of that stuff and more. So, you know, but it's a much more student-centered approach. But we know from the research that teacher candidates in particular lack a conceptual framework of what that looks like because they haven't had these experiences. They need a language system, they need ways of seeing it. They don't really have a rich vision of that as they start teaching. So we need to give them opportunities to learn to see teaching and learning, kids learning, to see kids and the ways that they can participate in learning in fundamentally different ways. And I want to say it as building off of sort of the cognition literature. It's not to say we want to get rid of all of those experiences that they had as students. I mean, that's their life experience, right? But instead we want to give them new experiences, new cognitive models, new schema, for example, or new constructs, or help them modify the constructs that they have. And so I think a lot about how we can design learning environments that can support teachers in developing new visions of teaching. And we know from some research, a good line of work that Maggie Lampert and Elham Kazemi and others, Randy, Lisa, others in the room have been developing, that tells us that when we create these carefully designed learning environments, it can help teachers develop new visions of teaching. So So let's think a little bit about noticing in particular, okay? So if we take this idea of developing a professional vision, I try to understand that and think about developing a professional vision by using the construct of teacher noticing. And I think about that by thinking about this idea of thinking about what they're attending to. So when we look at a picture or a video image, we can think about like what are all the things that can be seen in here, right? And for the sake of time, I decided we wouldn't watch a video, but because I know a lot of you do. But you can imagine, you know, at any given moment, there's so much to be seen. For those of us who have taught, we know that. For those of us who watch teachers teach, we know that. The project that I've done with Vicki Hand, we videotaped in teachers' classrooms. We selected some segments and then we sat down with them and asked the teachers, what were you noticing in these segments? And there would be these segments that were about 8 to 10 seconds long, and the teachers could talk at great length and in great detail about a range of things that they were paying attention to in those 8 to 10 seconds. So it is a lot of cognitive work is going on while teachers are teaching. And of course, what you notice, you know, we all know, you know, this used to drive me crazy when I was a teacher. You'd have the kid, I would just like walk by and kind of take the pen and ask them to set it down. Now I can just tune that out because I just know that's just like not an important thing in terms of teaching and learning, and might actually function for that student in a very important way. So I've come to learn through my graduate studies and interactions with colleagues to interpret things differently. What are the frameworks that teachers use? So we can look at this picture and we could, and again, in a video segment, there's a lot more to see here, but we can see a lot of things. We can see there's some mathematical work on the board. Every time I show this video to new teachers, they all cue in to the student who gets up and walks around the room. And I ask them, what is your assumption, like what is underneath? Why are you bringing that up? Why is that important? And just asking them that question prompts them to ask themselves, well, what is some underlying assumption they have about how kids should participate in a classroom? And why does it matter when a student gets up? I mean, Randy just got up, right? So, you know, and I could let that bother me as a teacher, or I could let it, right, as a speaker, or I could just let it go. I noticed it, but, you know, whatever, right? So we can see a lot here going on. We see a student's hand is raised. We can see how students are positioned. The chairs are sort of lined up in rows, but they're also turned in different ways. Suggests to me they might be doing some group work. So there's so much that we can see. And, you know, we have to really think about when we're working, especially with pre-service teachers, you know, what is important to attend to, and how do I make sense of that? What does this mean? What elements should I focus on? And going back to the point I raised earlier, learning to suspend attention is just as important as learning to notice. And so in the work I've been doing with pre-service teachers, I've been trying to help them really think about when they're watching a lesson and they're observing their mentor teacher, what are they paying attention to and why? And how is that guided by some theory of learning that they have? And when I ask them, what's your theory of learning, I see them kind of all bristle, because like, that's so theoretical and that doesn't feel very practical. But I say to them, every lesson is a design. If you are designing an activity for kids to do, you have a theory of how they're going to learn that thing at the end. And you're putting it into action the way you've organized people, the way you set up the content. So really think about what's that theory of how you learn. So in this course that I teach, I'm going to talk about the newest version. We've got a whole chunk where I'm constantly asking them, what is your theory of learning and how's that informing what you're looking at, the choices that you're making in how you're seeing your mentor teacher, and trying to actually get them to question that theory of learning that they have by the end of the course. So something I've been thinking a lot about because of different work that I've been doing is that noticing happens in a lot of different contexts of teaching. And I think, and I don't have this worked out, but I've been asking myself, is noticing different in these different contexts, or is it the same? I'm not really sure. I think there's some things that are probably the same, but I think there's some things, because it's so contextual, the activity, if I take a sort of activity system frame, I think the activity is going to recruit different kinds of practices that teachers are going to employ when they're engaged in that work. So for me, I've been thinking about, so there's noticing while I'm observing. If I'm a teacher and I'm asked to go out and participate and observe in a mentor-teacher's classroom, I'm gonna be watching that mentor teacher and doing some work to see that. Or if I'm watching a video, that is, I'm observing a situation. Then teachers might also do some noticing. So let me go back. So I've thought about it, that noticing while observing, I think it's something about some practices around decomposing instruction and breaking it apart and learning to look at and make sense of student thinking and participation. I don't know if this is quite right, but it's sort of like, that seems to me like what people might be doing when they're observing. When you're noticing and planning, I have a colleague, Rosella Santagata, and she and I wrote a paper about noticing and responding, and we started talking about this. And we thought about noticing in planning, and to me it's like, noticing there is you're doing some analysis of the mathematical tasks, so you're really noticing the math, and your noticing might be informed by trying to anticipate student thinking, so you might have to do some other kind of noticing there. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I've been thinking about it. Noticing while teaching, I think, is somewhat the same as noticing while observing, but I think there's some difference there in like how it's taken up, and I'm not sure yet what that is. But I think you're attending and interpreting to student thinking. You're attending and interpreting to power, access, patterns of participation. We could put a whole long list of lots of things people are paying attention to there. I'm not sure the teacher is paying as much attention to themselves while they're teaching as they are to all this other stuff that's going around. But while you're observing, there's a lot of attention on the teacher. So I've been thinking a little bit about like what is being attended to and how it's being attended to in these different contexts. And then I think in noticing and reflection probably recruits on some of these similar kinds of things. Attending again to student thinking and pedagogy, but there's this like deciding of next steps. And I know in the work that Randy and Lisa and Vicki Jacobs have done, that their noticing framework includes this idea of deciding, and that's happening in teaching. Maybe that's also happening in planning. I don't know if it's happening while observing. And so I've been thinking about this for a couple of reasons, but one is because when I review papers and then look back at my own work, which, you know, if I knew when I was in graduate school and Miriam and I wrote that paper that people were gonna like it, I think I probably would still be like toiling over it because I had no idea, honestly. I guess I'm really trying to figure out, like, how is the activity in which teachers are working, is noticing the same in all of those contexts, or is there some different work going on? So this is just for initial thinking. So today I'm going to talk about the work I've been doing, a study that I conducted with our pre-service teachers around their noticing while they're observing. Okay, so I just want to constrain it that way. I've written a couple papers of teachers noticing while they're teaching or their practices that they take up while they're teaching. And I've done some stuff around noticing as tied to reflection and analysis of teaching. But in this context, they were asked to observe some videos, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. So Rosella and I, we both started at UCI 10 years ago, or 11 years ago, and we said, wouldn't it be cool if there were a class on noticing and lesson analysis? No surprise, that's the work that she and I both do. So I said, well, I taught secondary, and she said, I've done some work with elementary. You take the elementary one, I'll do the secondary one. And that's kind of how this evolved, right? Like literally in the hallway, I remember us. And then we went and knocked on the director of the teacher ed program. We said, we've got this idea for a class. Can we just add one to the program? Sure. And that's kind of what happened. I mean, it was crazy. Yeah, it was kind of crazy.
That's the way it happens here too.
Yeah. So that's what we did. And I've done some work where I compare the cohort of teachers that I'm going to talk about today with the ones from, I call it 2 years prior because there was like an experimental year that was a bit of tweaking and messing around, and we don't look at the data in that in-between year. Because really what we did is just add the class to the program. There were no other changes to the program. And so we designed a course on noticing and lesson analysis. Rosella and I wrote a small paper about this. We show videos of both expert and novice teachers' classrooms. We use research-based frameworks for analyzing student thinking and ambitious math instruction. And then we ask them to design, teach, and analyze their own practice. We only, because it's a 10 to 12 weekish class, I say 12 weeks because we spread it a little bit a couple of years, and we can only get through one round of that design, teach, and analyze, and we were talking earlier, Donna and I, would always be ideal to do multiple rounds, and we're working on that with our program now. So the way I thought about this class when I designed it was that we had kind of this first phase in the beginning of the class. The first 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks were spent on just introducing the students to these frameworks for noticing ambitious instruction. So what does it mean to see student thinking? And even though those of us that agree in the room likely agree student thinking is just sort of a common phrase and we should be paying attention to that, a lot of students pay attention to students' answers and whether they're correct or incorrect. And so I had to really do a lot of work on how that's different from student thinking. And we would spend some time on that. We would take a look at, we've started more recently paying more attention to patterns of participation and student competence. Certainly an important issue, and I'm thinking about how to incorporate that more now in my class. Cognitively demanding tasks, teachers questioning to elicit student thinking and promote conceptual understanding, and then classroom discourse. So the first several weeks were like, let's just introduce these and try to understand what they're about, and let's watch some video and see if we can see these things in practice. Then we would continue with these, and then in phase 2 of the class, I focused a lot on, okay, let's learn how can we really describe what we're seeing? How can we get into the details of these kinds of things we're seeing? And we all know that when people look at video or look at classrooms, are kind of these oversimplified generalizations. Oh, the kids are really engaged. They really love the lesson. Well, what did you see that told you that, right? And they might be really engaged, but what are you seeing? What are you observing that's allowing you to draw that inference? And so we focused a lot on providing accurate descriptions, referencing artifacts as evidence, trying to really highlight points in time and looking at points in time, going back after a student would make a claim, and I would say, let's go back and look at that. And really trying to interrogate the meaning. For those of you who do this kind of work, I'd love to have a conversation with you about like the awkward silences that ensue in class when you try to do that initially, because I think the students aren't used to trying to unpack teaching that way. And so I always find that I have to do a lot of wait time and just let them know. What I've done in some cases is, there were a couple of years I would put a piece of art up at the beginning, and I would ask them to look at the piece of art and describe everything they see. And then we would look at a classroom lesson, and I would say, okay, now let's do the same thing. Because with art, that's sort of a genre where people are used to having done that before, and that would help get them going. And then in the third phase, the idea was that like we might have been focusing a lot on student thinking and trying to understand it in these detailed ways, a lot on looking at classroom discourse. So in the third phase, we're trying to connect those pieces. So how can you see the way that classroom discourse norms are structured that promote or inhibit or limit the kinds of opportunities for student thinking to emerge? Right, so the idea toward the end of the course was to try to see the integrated nature of these different features of instruction. So I paint that picture because as a learning scientist, I think a lot about how the design has some conjectures for the kind of learning that I want to see happen. So the questions that I asked were, do teacher candidates who participated in the video-based course, Learning to Learn from Teaching, develop new ways of noticing math instruction? And what is the nature and development of their noticing practices? How do their noticing practices develop over time? So I asked this question there were 31 students in the math methods, in the math cohort that year, and I was able to keep the math cohort for one section. And then we had 2 other sections that had all the other candidates. And I'm going to talk about that toward the end of the talk. The course was offered in the fall quarter of a 3-quarter credential program. I just ran into one of my students the other day who said, I loved that course in the fall. Why aren't we having it again now? And can we have it again in the spring? So I think they really see that this idea of looking at teaching and studying it is something that's useful kind of all the time. Again, I'll talk about that toward the end if we have time. So in this class, this was part of a research fellowship that I got from the Knowles Science Teaching Foundation. And so I was doing a research study and I asked them to do a pre and post video analysis task. So I showed them 2 video clips. I picked a clip from the Danette Sego's Learning to Teach Linear Functions. I just picked one of the clips that was on continuous and discrete functions. It had a whole class discussion. Looking back, maybe not the best clip to choose, but I thought it was a pretty good one at the time. This is always an issue. And then there was this really great clip that the Seeing Math project out of the Concord Consortium had on linear functions, where students are seated in groups of 4 and they're comparing cell phone plans. And the reason I chose these 2 is because one was a whole class discussion and one was small group, and students are positioned in different kinds of ways. And I wanted to see if the candidates noticed those kinds of things. The math is actually quite interesting in both of them. It's much more foregrounded in the second clip than it is in the first. But I wanted to see if they cue in on the mathematical ideas that students raise in that first clip. So I was, and the teachers, both teachers are really trying to do more ambitious forms of instruction. I wanted to see how they noticed that and interpret it. So what the prompts were, they were given, we watched the clip in class, then we watched clip number 1, and they were given these 4 prompts. What do you notice? Describe what's going on in the clip. How did the teaching support student thinking and learning? And was anything else noteworthy? So we watched the first clip. They answered those questions. And then I asked them, does anyone want to watch it again? We watched it a second time, and they had more time to answer the questions. About 30 minutes for each clip, okay?
Did they get all 4 questions at once?
They got all 4 questions at once. Yeah, it was sort of a form, and they filled it out. I've actually thought a lot about that, Randy, like what would it mean to develop something online that could cue them in different ways, and that's a different study. But yes, so they got all, and so that actually played into our analysis, because I think that when we were analyzing the data, as we were trying to understand some questions, it's like the things that they were noticing helped them answer this question. So we were trying to figure out how to code, and that became a little complicated for us. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. So these were the kinds of things we were looking for. Let me just quickly, for the second clip, it's called Equation for Dial and Go. This is the one that comes out of the Concord Consortium. If you don't know it, you can search for it online, and sometimes you can find the video somewhere in the materials buried away. But these are the kinds of things someone could notice in this clip. So that one student, Dante, he wants to find the point of intersection, and another student is focusing on finding the slope of the portion of the graph that has a rate of change. When students test the slope and interpret it in the context of the graph, they recognize the y-intercept is incorrect. There's a whole bunch of interesting mathematical thinking, so I'm just giving you the sense of kinds of things. In terms of the quality of the task, it promotes struggle, it's a lot of cognitive effort, it's non-algorithmic thinking, and there's a lot of reasoning that can be happening. For pedagogies for making thinking visible, the teacher uses a range of questioning. She's really positioned herself where the 4 students are in a square, and she's kind of at the end of the table, and she's kind of sitting back, and so she's letting them do all of the work, which from our classroom discourse framework that we used in the class comes out of Kim Hufford-Ackles, and it's Hufford-Ackles, Fusen, and Sharon, and we use that in the class to try to interpret and see what was going on in terms of classroom discourse norms. So the students are the source of ideas, they act as questioners. The teacher's questions are functioning to place responsibility in the hands of the students rather than sort of leading them to an answer. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff to see in the clip. So when we were coding it, we were kind of looking to see what kinds of things were they seeing relative to what could be seen in these clips. So our analysis, I'll tell you generally because the paper will be coming out and it has all the detail of what we did. But we went through multiple rounds of analysis where we kind of started with these categories that, we knew from the course was trying to get these candidates to notice, but we were trying to figure out how do we capture the range of things that they're seeing. Like, it didn't seem right to just say, because they labeled something student thinking, that everything looked the same in terms of student thinking. So we came up with a 3-level framework for 2 different dimensions. So what is noticed, which is they're like giving very little or no attention to the features of ambitious teaching. And level 2 was that they're giving comments related to those different components that I shared with you. And how they're noticing was sort of, is it like these overly simplistic, very general. There were some responses we could read, and the test for us was, could this apply to any clip? It was almost like, does it even matter? Do we even know which clip this is about? And that often told us it was kind of this overly general kind of, they weren't really getting into the details of what the interactions were that were in that clip. And then were they either linking, or were they kind of just seeing things as just distinct, separate, right? Remember the third part of the course is, are they integrating the observation? So we were wondering, we have one of our codes is around making connections. And so are they linking these components, or are they just seeing them as kind of discrete, okay? And I can answer more questions about that at the end. So the first thing we did is we went through, and this doesn't even give justice to the process of coding, as all of you know, and this is like my New Year's resolution, is to not let coding take me so long. That's like my 2017 New Year's resolution, just stop coding. But I think that we started by, you know, we kind of knew what was going on in the data. We did these multiple rounds where it's like, well, do we code each answer on all those dimensions, or how do you like make sense of these responses together, right? Do we chunk them, and how do we chunk them? What counts as an idea unit? You all know this. And eventually I said to the graduate students I was working with, I remember spending a weekend reading them, and I said, we can't just treat these as separate chunks. Let's just read these all together. Let's give them an overall score, and then let's write analytic memos about them. And so that's how we then proceeded. So we gave an overall score to each response. So what we found, pre to post, I'm going to go through this quickly, is just that from the beginning to the end of the course on all these dimensions, they shifted in their noticing, okay, of what they were seeing. So you can see early on, most of them are at like a level 0. They weren't even paying attention to the content or what they thought might be the learning goal, to much more attention to that here and at level 2. So they're getting much more detailed and inferential about what that task might be about and why it's important. And they were much more detailed about what the task was. They were noticing things that they were saying specifically what the task was and what the content might be that task was trying to get at. So we see that with student thinking, less attention early on, and more attention, more movement. Again, I'm also acknowledging they're still at level 1, so they're paying attention to it. They're describing it, not as inferential, but some of them are, okay? A lot of them were paying attention to pedagogies for making thinking visible early on. It's not surprising. They're paying attention to the teacher. And they're noticing that the teacher is asking kids to explain. That's sort of the generic response. But a more refined framework was informing their attention, and they were more inferential about what those moves were aiming to do later in the course. They were paying attention, again, to classroom discourse, but I would argue early on it was, and I can argue it by the level of specificity, it was more general. It was, you know, students are asked to talk to one another, but they weren't really getting into like what they were talking about and what their roles were. Whereas later in the class, we saw more of them shifting, you know, you see level 0 here to level 2. The thing I find interesting about it was that they were using the framework terminology, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, as they were highlighting things around classroom discourse. They became much more specific, and they somewhat made more connections, but not a whole lot more, okay? I think that's hard. It's hard to do. And it might be the task didn't do a good job with that as well. The way we structured those questions might not have gotten at that. But I also think it's, you know, it was a 10 or 12-week class. Maybe by that time they just hadn't had enough opportunity to engage in that. This to me is like exciting, and we could have written a paper, but this has been written before. Lots of people have found this. So I thought, this is great. My graduate students are like, this is wonderful. I said, yeah, but like lots of people have written that before. We know that if you put people in a learning experience that they're gonna learn something. It would be more interesting if it like stayed here in some sense, right? So I just wanna give you a sense of like what a generic, this is a typical response in the pre-analysis to the Dial and Go clip. So the student Nita, this is an excerpt from her response. This clip is about a small group with a teacher discussing a problem. The students have some graph, they're discussing the graph together. Teacher didn't explain much, she only asked guiding questions. Students are very comfortable talking, discussing their thinking, they're able to discuss and explain. They can also analyze the graph to support their ideas. This way of teaching creates a good environment for students to talk about the math, explain themselves, and understand the problem. Again, it's a nice beginning response, but it doesn't really tell me anything about the kids' thinking. It doesn't tell me anything about specifically what the teacher's doing. It could be almost about any clip, okay? In the post-task, her response is much different. So students are working in a small group of 4 with the teacher. They're working on graphing a linear equation. A student starts a discussion with a question. One of them gives some reasons why the graph looks the way it looks. They discuss the growth of the graph. After every 100 minutes, quote, it goes up $30. The teacher keeps asking questions to make students think about slope and y-intercept. She uses the student's incomplete work to give some hint to the whole group. Students have a problem finding the slope. They use the graph and point to the graphs to explain their ideas. The teacher does not answer students' questions directly. She asks questions to make students think about the problem and allows them time to work. This helps scaffold students' thinking and helps them be more independent. So I think, my sense is this is a different response. Do you all agree? Mm-hmm. Okay. So we'll just quickly kind of see what's different about it. So she's noticing the math. She highlights things about student thinking. One of the things that took my graduate students a while to notice was the difference between student answer. The students had the correct answer and then a student thinking comment. And so they would code those the same, and I would say, is this really the same? And so then, so I'd help them pay attention to that kind of thing. So more attention to, this is how they're attending to student thinking. The way the teacher participates, right, is very different in this excerpt, noticing that. And so I'm not surprised they can develop skills at noticing, that's great. But my question, and Randy after reviewing my paper knows that this is kind of the thing I do, is I always say, well, is it the same for all of them? Do they all look the same? This is my other New Year's resolution. Don't ask this question anymore. I keep thinking, why do I keep asking this? But it's curious to me. And what is the variation in their noticing over time? So I'm going to try to quickly show you some things that I found. Again, I was really curious about this design. And how might this design be tied to the ways that they notice instruction? I look at Beth because she and I are on a project together and we're thinking about designing professional development. I'm thinking, so when we think about designing professional development, we could be making conjectures about how it's going to be supporting them. So our second phase is that we generated a framework to characterize what we're calling noticing practices. And we returned to each case and we looked at their analytic memos to gain deeper insight in the variation among the 31 candidates' responses. And we thought about this because of the work. I was thinking a lot about Erickson's work and Mason and McDonald and others who are really helping us think about teaching as this purposeful, intentional, practice-based act, right? And so if we can think about that, and it's in the last couple of years I've been in conversations with people and I hear them talk about teachers noticing, and then I hear other people say noticing practices, and I keep thinking, okay, are we talking about the same thing? So I wanted to try to understand this a little bit better. So I started looking inside of this data, and what I found were some different, I started kind of with these, I didn't have this the first time around, and I had these sort of approaches, is what I called them, that I thought described and characterized the ways the candidates were noticing. And then I went back and thought about them as, so are there some similarities and differences, and if they're a practice, what is the practice that's entailed? So the first practice that I defined is attending to features of instruction. That is a practice, which is I'm going to be attending to something. And the two ways that I define these candidates do it is that they either use generic frameworks or they used framework terminology. The second practice is elaborating on observations. So this is these more descriptive, getting inside the details, seeing that. So we saw some people providing detailed descriptions and others exploring the details of ambitious instruction. And then the last practice is what we call integrating observations to reason about instruction. So this approach is what I call blending visions of teaching to analyze instruction. And this last one is using a vision of ambitious teaching to systematically analyze instruction. So you can probably see that an approach within each practice is tied to the framework. So this one is like, are they using the framework to help inform what they attend to? Is the framework helping, like are they expanding, is their noticing guided by the framework, and then do they do a lot of elaborating around that? The blending visions was kind of the most striking to me. This is people who would have some segments where they're really attending to issues around ambitious teaching and writing about them in more detailed ways, but then they would go back and talk about something that was more of a folk theory of teaching and learning. So it was like these two visions of instruction, which I think not surprising for new teachers in a credential program to kind of be seeing all this stuff, right? But in that case, what was interesting to me is that they were still elaborating and trying to make sense of it in both cases, which is useful and worthwhile, right? And this last one is when they're noticing is largely structured by the framework of ambitious instruction. They're trying to integrate what they're seeing. So I'm going to give you some examples. I want to show you a little bit of the representation and the data. I think there were 31 candidates whose pre and post analyses that we looked at, and there were 22 or 23 who at the beginning of the class started using generic frames, similar to that example I showed you at the beginning, or a few slides ago. And they changed in lots of different ways, those 22 people. Some of them continued to just use generic frames. There were 3 of them, didn't shift at all. 2 of them shifted to just use framework terminology, which is kind of label some things, but there really wasn't much elaboration around what they were seeing. 5 or 6 started using generic frames and shifted to just providing detailed descriptions. So it's almost like they picked up that second part of the course, right? Which was like, let's get into a lot of details, but they're noticing wasn't framed by the vision of those features of ambitious instruction. 5 or 6, I hope you're not doing the math, totally my math here. We're exploring details of ambitious pedagogy. So they weren't doing much integration of them, but they would highlight maybe 1 or 2 that they were noticing and do a lot of observation analysis around it. And then a couple, 2 or 3 were blending visions. There were some, 5 or 6 I think, who started the course providing detailed descriptions, and they shifted to taking up the framework and then elaborating on it. And some of them, I can't remember the number offhand, some of them also, in their case, they were sort of still drawing on frameworks they brought into the class, but also picking up frameworks. So that's kind of interesting to me that they're doing both. And then there were some people, 3 candidates who entered the course blending visions of ambitious instruction. So they kind of came in knowing that like, oh, there's this world out there and math ed people who think this is like good things should be happening in math. They knew how to look at a math classroom actually and see some things, but they also were drawing on more folk theories, and they were the 3 who shifted to looking at ambitious instruction. So I'm going to just take a few minutes to show you a couple of examples to illustrate this. We've seen a generic example. This is another one. The class is nicely decorated with posters, good classroom setup. The teacher can walk through the aisles easily. There's a pie poster in front of the class. I don't think I knew that until I looked at it. Oh, really? I didn't notice that. Students are trying to figure out an equation of the pattern and generalize it. Right, so we could see good classroom atmosphere. This is not surprising, just entering the program. That's how they're looking at teaching. So some of these folks, when I say shift to using framework terminology, this is what it looked like. So we would see them using the phrases. Like this one student, throughout her essay, you saw student thinking, student thinking, student thinking. And when we're coding it and we weren't picking up on that, I'm like, wait a second, you guys look at this. The pre is all about correct answers or nothing. It's about the aisles in the room. Now they're really paying attention to student thinking. That's a phrase we use throughout the entire course, right? So they're starting to cue into that, but very little elaboration. It's like these kind of, almost like, although the clip was short, we could still see student thinking happening. Okay, it's happening. What did you see happen about it, right? Can you tell me a little bit more? But we saw them using the terms. For the folks who were providing detailed descriptions, so we saw them using quotes a lot. They would insert quotes and excerpts that they heard in the clip. The other way that we saw this is that, and some of you have probably seen this when you ask teachers, they wrote these really long detailed narratives of everything that happened step by step. So there's no discriminating, right? So if we go back to the beginning, right, noticing is about knowing what to attend to and what not to attend to. So I think when we saw the narrative, the very long narrative, there doesn't seem to be much framework that's guiding to help them think about what can I let go of here, right? The exploring the details of ambitious pedagogy. So now we saw some responses where people labeled, like from the framework in the class, and then they wrote specific things that they saw related to it, which I thought that was kind of interesting. They kind of knew. They were like calling out, right? They were doing the thing that Fredrickson talks about, making a call out. And then doing more detail around it. The folks who were blending visions, so this one was really interesting to me. So this person, Math Talk Community Level 3, if you're familiar with the Hufford-Ackles framework, like we could talk about what that is. And they had some detail about what made them think that. Students share ideas, explain what they know, say if they agree or disagree. Teachers asking questions to require students to check understanding, which is like putting them in that role. And the task requires conceptual understanding. So really, this is around what the class was about. And then at the end, the student asks, what does the teacher do when students throw down the pencil and lose interest? What happens when students don't like to put effort into solving problems? Like, where did that come from? It didn't happen anywhere in the clip. And it's an interesting question, but that's just a totally different framework coming in and shaping what this person's noticing. So and again, not a problem, but the person's interested in something around motivation, interest, which was not part of the framework. But maybe they're getting that somewhere else, in the program, I don't know. But that's how we thought about blending visions. And then these folks who provided details, and I'm not going to give you an example because you just saw someone providing a detailed description to shifting to one of these two, but I will give you an example of someone who shifts to using, blending visions to using a systematic analysis. So these are hard to give an example of because they're really long, their responses are much longer. So this one person in particular, he noted some quotes. Someone from this group, teachers asking for participation, show us how you got it, teacher asks to explain. How many agree with, informally assessing student thinking. So he's like highlighting, he's calling out the specific thing, and then he's got some interpretation going next to it about like what that's doing in the learning environment. And then he writes, the teacher asks students to share their work and asks for students to articulate their thinking, references what students do, quote what Irma said. Rather than focus on the right answer or one correct procedure, the teacher continues to solicit different ideas, explicitly asks for someone to explain a different way, and does not attach judgment. The teacher creates a discourse where students can share their ideas without having them validated by the teacher as right or wrong. So when you look at this a whole response, you see a lot of this kind of paying attention and integrating students, class discourse, the way students are participating, their thinking, and what the teachers are doing in these responses. We didn't have a lot that did that. So just real quickly, so that's sort of the paper that we put forth. So yes, the video-based course can help them attend to things. I think that's great that we have a paper that can contribute to that, but I think we know that by now. There were a couple really great reviews that came out in the last couple of years that tell us that and push some other questions. I think it's important to know that candidates do enter attending and elaborating, but they need some frameworks to help them guide what they see. They try to do the work, we ask them to do the work, but they need some frameworks. And I do think that at least the course provided them limited opportunities to learn to integrate observations in meaningful ways. We just didn't see much evidence of that happening. So I think we need to think more about how the course is designed to try to do that. Some limitations, certainly there are other components of ambitious instruction that we need to think about. Issues related to equity, issues related to curriculum, there's a whole long list we could think about. But I sort of anchored it in that framework because I think that's a pretty useful framework for beginning teachers. We only had one source of data. We'd be worth looking at some other sources of data to corroborate and see if we can get some, or triangulate our findings and see if we see these same kinds of practices as they're observing teaching. And again, this is noticing in one context. What are the practices? If they're noticing in other contexts, would those be the same? And I just want to conclude by raising a few different questions, which are, what are the aspects of the course that need to be redesigned, potentially to cultivate more robust forms of noticing? I'm really interested, because I'm now overseeing our credential program, I think the class is really important, but I'm really curious about what vision of instruction are they developing through their participation in a variety of courses, and how are those coordinated or not? And I think a lot about Linda Darling-Hammond's work on coherence within a program. And I know we think a lot about that coherence with our field sites, but I just think we have to think about coherence within our own programs and how we get that happening. So we've been doing a lot of work at UCI to try to get our own assumptions visible about teaching and learning and see what's coherent or not. And again, this last question about what are some similarities and differences in noticing practices when noticing in different contexts. When you're observing, when you're planning, when you're teaching, when you're reflecting. Are they the same and are they different? So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions.
So my dissertation work examines how to use videos in pre-service training to help pre-service teachers develop mathematical knowledge for teaching. And part of my analysis is using noticing to account for how the mathematical knowledge for teaching develops. And I keep coming back and thinking that there's this linkage or this correlation between teacher knowledge and teacher noticing. And I'm not using teacher noticing in the same way, but I don't have any crystallized thoughts on this, but I'm curious if, given that you have a lot more experience, if you have thoughts on that. Like, what are the connections between teacher knowledge and teacher noticing?
Well, I don't know the answer to that because I haven't studied their knowledge for teaching developing, but my hunch, and I wonder if people, Randy and Lisa and others would agree, that I think it's there's sort of this reciprocal thing that can go on. I think that if you help direct teachers to notice certain kinds of things, that can help them develop their knowledge for teaching, and that by developing their knowledge for teaching in those ways, they're going to learn to notice those things differently, right?
Yeah.
So I think a lot about the IMAP videos, for example. I think if you can help candidates learn to look at those as an instance of student thinking and then unpack that, that's going to help them build a more robust understanding of the mathematics. And then when they're working with kids and they know to be attuned to listen to that, they're going to pay more attention and to continue to build more robust understandings of mathematics. Yeah. That's my hunch. You might look at the work of Nikki Kirsting.
Okay.
She has done some work on trying to measure teachers' math knowledge for teaching, I think, and she uses like a noticing. I think she has like a measure that requires watching video, and she does something related to that, so you can look at that.
Thank you.
But I think it would be super cool to really intentionally choose particular content and try to attune. So Miriam and I, when we did this work years ago, with working with pre-service teachers, what I found in-service teachers in the video clubs, what I found so fascinating was when we had really interesting clips that got them curious about the kids' thinking, the mathematical talk and the representations that would come on the board, and I thought, certainly they're starting to understand this math better. right? Because they really started just digging into the math and not so much about the kids thinking. And we have this one amazing segment where they're kind of like going back and forth between the math and then, okay, well now let's look, is this what the kid's thinking? Well, wait, that doesn't make sense with what we were doing. And those kinds of contexts seem to build a robust space for that to happen. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any similar work at post-secondary level?
What is her
So
name?
I'm thinking of
Spear, Natasha Spear.
programs where we train tutors to sit in a learning lab with
Mhm.
dropping kids. We often show them videos, but I don't know of anybody who's preparing them to deal with those videos.
Yeah. Oh, so Natasha Spear, who, gosh, where is she now?
Maine.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, like she used to be, I think, at Michigan State or something. Yes, so she's in Maine. She's the one person I know of who's done like video clubbish kind of work and video-based things at the secondary level that jumps off the top of my head.
She wrote a great paper in 2005. but-
Yes, yeah. I was trying to think. I know kind of around that. Yes, thank you.
You mentioned, you said the phrase folk theory?
Yeah.
Like folk theory of instruction, is that?
Yeah, yeah.
I'd love to hear more about your
Well, I mean,
definition of that or thought about it.
my definition of it is, and this has just been 15 years of working with teachers, and I'm sure we could probably, Lisa kind of laughs, because I think we could probably put like piece of paper in the middle of the table and we'd come up with the same thing. I just think it's a lot of like this idea of students being engaged, students being interested, students being motivated, the student, that it's more about behavior, more driven by their behaviors.
Was that an example when the student wrote that, what if the students don't feel like working hard?
Yeah, yeah.
That's eliciting a...
That's
That's
kind of
your
what I am interpreting it as. Yeah, I can't find it right now, but yes. And I think I could, if I spent a little bit more time thinking about it, I could probably find some literature, like back in my dissertation that I might have referenced, where that we know that sort of these are informed by sort of U.S., it's a U.S. culture of teaching. So if you look at sort of, the teaching gap,
Sure.
and some of the work that I think Ron Gallimore and James Hebert and Jim Stigler, I think you can look there and sort of see how they characterize it. I think Kevin Miller has done some work where he's done cross-cultural. Miller and Zhao, 2007 is a paper that's coming to mind. And Kevin Miller also has a paper in the Noticing book that Randy is an editor of. And I think I can't remember for sure, but I think the Miller and Zhao paper, he talks about the ways that US teachers sort of look at teaching, and it tends to be these more behavioral kinds of things. Did you have anything to add to that? No? That's what comes to mind, but I'd be glad to talk to you afterward about that more. Yeah, and I use the term folk theory because in I've got Noel Anyadi, who's at UCLA. He was the editor for the CNI paper, and we had, he owes me a lot of glasses of wine. He just asked me to cut a lot of words from the paper. I'm going to tell him that. But he pushed me on that with this paper, and I've been trying to think about what are these folk theories that people bring to looking at teaching.
Well, I was a teacher.
Yeah.
I was a teacher for a long time.
Yeah.
I think to me that elicits like, what did I hear in the teacher break room?
Yes, exactly.
Like, well, these
Yeah.
students.
Yes, yeah.
They did test into this course, so I'm wondering how.
Yes.
Or, in our district, we have to follow the pacing guide, so.
Right.
So.
Yes. And I think we could link some of these kinds of comments that teachers make to maybe the ways they see constraints or the ways they have been socialized to characterize kids. Yeah.
I was interested in your finding about the blended vision, or just how teachers started piecing together different things as time went on. My question kind of is how do you think the explicit instruction of these frameworks kind of at that beginning, that phase one, as well as just the curriculum overall for these teachers, how do you think that influences kind of what those teachers decide as applicable or important, or what kind of, if you could put yourself in those teachers' minds, like how do you think they're able to sort of piece that all together, you know, and how does that come out kind of in your work?
So, I mean, you know, they're in a course, and a course has assignments, and the assignments are asking them to do certain kinds of things. So, I think in that sense, they're paying attention, and another assignment that we had in the class is they have to do a student interview. So we actually show them the IMAP, a couple IMAP videos, and I show them, there's these videos out of North Carolina that were pretty good, of just someone doing like a clinical interview. And, but I'd have to have a lot of discussions with them, like for the student interview, I would say to them, your job is not to teach them anything. Your job is to listen to them and to try to figure out what they're thinking. And I learned I had to find a couple interesting tasks, and then they'd get all upset because the tasks weren't related to what the kids were working on that week in their field site, and they were really losing sight of and I kept saying, this is not about teaching them. And I had a student say to me, this feels so irresponsible. And finally I said, well, it's really irresponsible that you're not listening to kids. Like, you gotta listen to students. You know, they're like the people in your room. And so he and I had like kind of a fun banter back and forth that we could do that. But I said, it is irresponsible if we don't learn to pay attention to kids. It's irresponsible if we don't have a framework that helps us. And I think as teacher educators, and this is what I'm trying to do in our program, is to get us to at least have a coherent framework that we're trying to work on. And I think that if we can all agree that like the task, the way we want kids to engage in discourse, the way we assess them at the end of a lesson, if we can like, the way we think about equity, you know, 5 or 8 things, I don't know what that number is. I don't know if it's 55 or if it's 21 or if it's 7. 55 seems too many and 7 seems too small. But I feel like this is something that we're gonna be studying now, is like, what are these competing narratives that they're getting from different places in the program? And one of the things I think is really important is that this class should really not be a standalone class. It should be embedded in math methods. It should be embedded in science methods. Actually, our science methods instructor, the science candidates shouldn't even have to take my class, because they do all of this in her class. And so it's almost counter, because I'm now teaching the class to all candidates, and that's a whole different set of design challenges, like foreign language. And I have to think, I don't know how you think about teaching foreign language, so I've been really thinking about that, and you know, that's been tricky. And how do you think about attending to kids thinking in a foreign language class? I mean, certainly that's important, but what does it mean? I can think about it in the core disciplines, and I even have been able to think about it in art and music. But it's harder for me when foreign language has been the one that's really thrown me. So, but I'm not answering your question well. I mean, I know that, but I mean, I think part of it was like, it's a course. These are assignments. They're paying attention to it. The question for me is what happens several months later. And I actually analyzed their packed comments, and that's a different talk.
So Beth needs to head out around 2, and she's happy to stay around here. There's nothing that she's scheduled to do. So if people want to sit and talk with her, ask her questions, you're welcome. Yeah. We're after 1, and I know that this is kind of a captive room, and so I want to thank Beth again and allow us to.
You know,